We have been discussing the different grazing types of our ruminants specifically. We're going to start talking a little bit more from a management perspective in terms of grazing multiple species on a piece of rangeland. Multi species grazing is one of those buzzwords in the range world that is highly accepted across multiple disciplines. So, the official definition is when more than one kind of livestock graze a unit of land. So, that grazing can occur either at the same time or at different times and still be considered multi species grazing. So, grazing that occurs at the same time is less frequent here in the West, especially on public lands, in a managed scenario versus the Midwest in the grasslands. So, multi species grazing is not a new concept, it's actually normal for naturally occurring ecosystems. So, if we think about land that has been had little influence from humans, so think public lands, national parks, those type of things. Multi-species actually come in and graze those areas, mostly in the form of wildlife. So this is not a new concept. We just, always have to have something new and fun to do as scientists and come up with new buzzwords, so we copy Mother Nature. Some of the advantages associated with grazing multiple species of livestock are our ability to actually increase the grazing capacity. So, for example, with with cattle who primarily are grass consumers, and with goats that are primarily shrub consumers, we can actually increase the total amount of units that a certain piece of land will support if that land has both grasses and shrubs on it. We can also, multi-species grazing also will improve botanical composition because of each type of rangeland plant plus the species within each of those categories are going to be challenged to grow more often. So you can actually increase the total species of grasses and forbs and shrubs in an area by grazing multiple species. Also, we can use multiple or different species grazing either at the same or different times to suppress undesirable, weedy, or invasive plants. And by allowing multiple species grazing to take place, we can actually increase individual animal performance of one or multiple species in the mix. And multi species grazing can actually help with animal health issues as well. So, for example, in Australia, where sheep have been the primary grazer on rangeland, those sheep are going to adapt to new parasites very, very quickly. And so, if you introduce a new species to graze along with them, like cattle or wildlife species, you can actually reduce the parasite load just from introducing another species. So we can improve animal health from that perspective as well. In addition, by grazing multiple species, especially at the same time, you can reduce predation of the smaller ruminants like sheep and goats. So sheep and goats tend to be pretty bonded to cattle, so they can actually serve as a buffer between a predator and the small ruminant. And if you're grazing multiple species, then you can have greater net return on your ranch because you're actually selling two different products, and most likely that's going to be two different times of the year. And all of these things improve cash flow by being able to market at different times of the year. So, for example, if you're running a cow-calf operation that calves in the spring and you sell weaned calves in the fall, you would have income coming in the fall. And if your lambs were lambing in the spring as well, then chances are you would actually wean them in late spring, early summer, and be able to sell them at that point in the year as well. And all of these things help to reduce the financial risk associated with different enterprises. Some of the challenges associated with multi-species grazing are fencing. That's one of the most costly and most common problems. If you are on an allotment that has cattle fence on it, then that typically is not going to hold sheep and goats. So you end up having to manage sheep and goats a little bit differently if you're in a fencing situation or if you're trying to create rotational grazing. A lot of times you may have more intensive management of fences, even if it's the electronic variety. Some folks are also going to be challenged because they just don't have the experience with the second type of grazer. So, for example, there's some ranchers in Shasta County that have been cattle ranchers for the last 30 or 40 years, and they were really wanting to experience or utilize goats because they have a lot of shrub areas on their BLM permit. And once they got the goats, they ran into a whole slew of new problems just because they hadn't had any experience with goats before. And mostly it centered around predation and keeping goats contained. So the more you add to an operation, the more diverse and complex it can be. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to um, diversify your enterprise. And then another challenge actually has to do with animal health as well. So if you get a disease that is zoonotic that shows up in one species and can be transferred to the other species, if you're grazing multiple species together, you can actually see that disease move from one species into another. So you just have to be very, very cognizant of vaccinations and treatment protocols. So when we're trying to graze multiple species, we've learned over years and years and years of research that different types of grazers are actually going to have different diet selectivity. So if we were grazing horses and sheep, or horses and goats, we would know that our pasture needs to have adequate amounts of grass and adequate amounts of browse because that is what plant type these two species are going to utilize. If we are trying to manage for not only our domestic species but our wild grazers as well, and we want to increase pronghorn populations on our piece of rangeland or even mule deer populations, then we know that we're going to have to manage to get more growth of browse and grasses if we're trying to manage cattle or our sheep as well. So just balancing all of these things together can get pretty complex. That's why knowing what your range produces, the biodiversity it has, and what plant types are there in abundance, especially at different areas of an allotment, is very, very important. All right, so that ties up foraging strategies and multi-species grazing, and we'll jump into rangeland nutrition in the next series.